but good to follow directions.
Okay.
Magid Shir, you listen to him, right?
Okay.
Okay, everybody, welcome to another evening with Rabbi Wolvovsky. And those who have been participating have been benefiting from his presentations, not only on halacha that's applicable in a contemporary situation, but especially because it comes from the parsha of the week, and along with that, gives us a real opportunity to understand the essence of the halacha as well. Rabbi Wolvovsky, bavakasha.
Thank you, Rabbi Green. Um, so obviously, as we do every week, we're going to be going into a topic of halacha, a theme, halachic themes that are related to the Sedra, to the parsha of the week. And we're going to do that this week as well. However, before I get into the topic of this week, I want to speak about something that we're going to get to at the end. But I think it's a good way to start. I want to start with Asar B'Tevis, the fast of the 10th of Tevis, which is this Friday. The Avud Raham, which is a sefer of halacha, he writes that during the time when we established Rosh Chodesh, the Jewish month, based on Re'iyah, based on the sighting of the moon, and basically it was not predictable when exactly the days of Rosh Chodesh would be. So he says like this, he says, if Asara B'Tevis would fall out on Shabbos, we would fast even on Shabbos. You see, nowadays it's not able to fall on Shabbos, but he says, this is what Avudraham writes. He writes that if Asar B'Tevis, the fast of the 10th of Tevis, would fall out on Shabbos, we would fast even on Shabbos. Now, that's something that you don't have Tisha B'Av. Tisha B'Av, if it falls out on Shabbos, we push it off. Shiva Asar Tammuz, we don't have that. Obviously, Tzim Gedalia, we don't have that. Tainus Esther, we don't have that. We only have that for Yom Kippur. The Avudraham says it would apply to Asar B'Tevis. Why? He says because Asar B'Tevis, the 10th of Tevis, is the most severe of all of them, being that it's the first in the narrative of the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. Because Asar B'Tevis is the day that Yerushalayim was brought into siege, which was basically the first step of the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. The first being the worst. Therefore, we would fast even if it fell out on Shabbos. Now, nowadays, as I said earlier, it's not able to fall out on Shabbos, but Asar B'Tevis does remain the only one of these fasts that could fall out on Friday. And we are mashlim, we finish the fast into Shabbos. So to a degree, we are even doing that nowadays, fasting into Shabbos on Asar B'Tevis, and that's how it is going to be this week, this year. Now, the rule that the Gemara teaches us is that Meruba Mida Toiva Mimidas Puranius. Hashem's measure of Toiva, of good and kindness, is greater than Hashem's measure of punishment. In that case, if the negative of the fast of Asar B'Tevis is the worst from all the other fasts, we must say that the message, the positive message that's within Asar B'Tevis must also be to a degree greater than all the other fasts. That is my introduction. That I'm going to put on the side. At the end, we're going to get back to Asar B'Tevis. But the halachic topic that we're going to be focusing on today is arvus. Arvus is being a guarantor. I have two friends. One of them is lending money to the other, and he says, I'm only going to give you money if you have a guarantor. And I say, I'll be an arev, iron reish beis. I'm going to be an arev. I'm going to be a guarantor to pay up the loan. If he doesn't have $100 at the day, I'm going to come and pay the $100. Now, there is another thing. It's called a kablan. It's similar, but it's not the same. In some places, it's actually called an arev kablan. A kablan is different than being a guarantor. Perhaps the English word would be an underwriter. I don't know. I just in my own thinking, maybe that would be the right term. But let me describe what it is. You see, an arev, a guarantor, how does it play out? The person who is owed the money goes first to the loiva, to the one who's in debt, and he tells him, you owe me $100. He says, I don't have. So then he goes to the guarantor to collect the money. A kablan is direct. He doesn't even go to the person in debt to get the money. He goes directly to this individual, the underwriter, who said, you just come to me and I'll pay you back. It's a different type of commitment. It's a much more, I guess, a greater commitment in terms of paying back the loan. But they're not the same. And that's going to be important for this Gemara. So the Gemara in Bava Basra, Daf Kuf Ayin Gimel Amud Beis, has a discussion about where do we learn the din, where do we learn the laws of arvos? Meaning, why should it be that way? If someone lends someone else money, okay, so the person who borrowed the money has to pay back. Where in the Torah do we see that somebody who didn't lend the money, someone who didn't borrow the money, could obligate themselves and halachically be obligated? Amar Rav Huna said, Minayin la'ariv de. How do we know that a guarantor is obligated to repay the loan? Where in Torah do we see this? He didn't do any kinyan. Usually you have to make a kinyan, you have to make do something to acquire it, lift the money, do something. Here he just says with his words, I will pay back, and he becomes the ariv. Diksiv, the pasuk says, this is from last week's parsha, but its topic continues into this week's parsha. Yehuda, when speaking about his younger brother Binyamin and taking him down to Mitzrayim to bring him before Yosef, he says, Anoichi arvenu miyadi tivakshenu. I will be his guarantor, and you should request it from me. In other words, it's going to be my responsibility, says Yehuda, to return Binyamin to you, to Yaakov. From here, we learn the matter, the halacha of arvus. In this week's parsha, once again, Yehuda tells Yosef, he says, Ki avdecha arev asanar. Why am I the one who's so worried about Binyamin? Because I am an arev. I am a guarantor for Binyamin. Rav Huna says this is the source that we learn the dinim, we learn the laws of guaranteeing a loan. Comes Rav Chizda. Rav Chizda, sort of the word maskif means he attacks. He objects to Rav Huna. He says, maskif la Rav Chizda, hakablanasi. This is not, Yehuda's situation is not an arev. He's not a guarantor. He is a kablan. He is much more than a guarantor. In other words, we still have to find a place in the Torah that someone who says, I will pay up the loan for him, becomes obligated and is a valid commitment. Because the case of Yehuda taking Binyamin is not a guarantor. He is a kablan. He's taking Binyamin and he has to bring him back. In other words, he's not stepping in for somebody else. Diksiv, as the pasuk says, Tuna oisai al yadi va'ani ashivenu. Give him to me and I will return him. So it's not an arev. An arev means give it to him and I will pay you back if he doesn't have the money. The situation that Yehuda was in is not an arev, says Rav Chizda. So where in the Torah do we learn the din of an arev, the din of a guarantor? Ella Amar Rabbi Yitzchak. Rather, Rabbi Yitzchak says mehacha from here. We learn it from a pasuk in Mishlei, a pasuk that Shlomo HaMelech says. He says, I'm going to read the whole pasuk, but the point is actually right in the beginning. He says, Lakach bigdei ki arev zar geimer, oimer b'ni merafta l're'acha takata l'zar kapecha chulu. He says, we see clearly in Shlomo HaMelech's language in Mishlei, Lakach bigdei ki arev zar. You could take his clothing because he is a guarantor for another person. Zar is a foreigner. So we don't have a proof in the Torah, but we have the proof in the Ksuvim. We have a pasuk in Mishlei that introduces us to the concept of an arev, of a guarantor. So we just learned the Gemara. Typically, when you learn a Gemara and it says Ella Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, the word Ella means rather, as if that the previous statement was disputed. The original statement that we learned, the idea of a guarantor from Yehuda and Binyamin in this week's parsha, is disputed. We would say in a Gemara term, you would say it was shlugged up. Let's say in yeshiva term, it was shlugged up. It was completely disputed. And Rabbi Yitzchak is coming with an alternative answer. However, it's interesting to note and important to note that in many sources in Halacha, when they write what's the source in Torah for a guarantor, that a guarantor is actually obligated, they write Yehuda and Binyamin. Ki avdecha arev esanar. They quote this week's parsha. So although from the simple narrative of the Gemara, it seems like we disputed that and we do not accept Yehuda as the source of the idea of guaranteeing a loan, nevertheless, in Halacha, in Rashi, in the Gemara, in Gittin, he also does that. When he wants to write a source, what source does he write? Not the pasuk that Rav Yitzchak brings, rather from Yehuda and Binyamin. In addition, there's another reason why to understand that there's validity to accepting that the source of this idea is actually from Yehuda and Binyamin in this week's parsha. What is that? Mefarshim point out that this machlokes, the machlokes that we are learning about now, what is the source of a guarantor? And actually, what is the source of a guarantor? Because was Yehuda a guarantor, or was he an underwriter? Was he an arev, or was he a kablan? Is based on another machlokes later on in the Gemara between the same people, Rav Huna and Rav Chizda. And that is as follows. The Gemara over there is speaking about different language, different verbiage, different terms that would make a person into a guarantor. In other words, what words does he have to use? Obviously, if he says, I am a guarantor, that makes him a guarantor. But if a person says words like this, the words in Hebrew are halveyu v'ani efra, lend him and I will repay. Or halveyu v'ani noisin, or lend him and I will give. I'll give you back the money. So the Gemara brings a machlokes, argument between Rav Huna and Rav Chizda, the same people, the same characters. Rav Huna over there says you use that language, anoichi arvenu, halveyu v'ani arvenu, is a guarantor. Rav Chizda says you use that language, you're not a guarantor, you are a kablan, you are an underwriter. If he says halveyu v'ani efra, lend him and I will repay. So the Mefarshim say, you see that based on their opinions on what they think about this language is what they're going to say what Yehuda's status was. Yehuda said, Yehuda sort of made himself into an arev, and he said, I'm going to repay, I'm going miyadi tivakshanu, you can come to me to get it, to get Binyamin. Does that make him a guarantor, or does that make him a kablan? And it's the same two people that are having this machlokes. Now, why am I getting into this? I actually, while I'm speaking, I want to make sure that I'm not getting too caught up into that machlokes. Because the only thing I want to get from there is that the bottom line of that Gemara is actually on the side of Rav Huna, the one that in our Gemara seems to be disputed. The halacha sides with Rav Huna. The point that I'm trying to get out of this is that although, again, from the simple narrative of the Gemara, it seems like Rav Huna's opinion that we learn it from Yehuda and Yosef was disputed, nevertheless, we do see that it's not so absolute. So, we do see that it is quoted as a valid opinion that we learn and we base the dinim, the laws of arev, of a guarantor, from this week's parsha from Yehuda and Binyamin. That's the point I wanted to get out of this Gemara. Now, before we go further, there's a question. It's actually two questions, but it could be, put together as one, intertwined as one. But let me start it by saying two questions. Two questions on the opinion of Rav Huna. Number one, Yehuda, let me start again. The question is, how could we learn from Yehuda? Number one, Yehuda was not a guarantor. Yehuda was the actual person who was taking the loan. It wasn't a loan, but he was taking Binyamin. And he's saying, I'm going to give him back. Why is that a guarantor? A guarantor means you give it to him and I am going to repay if he cannot pay. Yehuda doesn't seem to be a guarantor at all. He actually seems more to be a loiva, a debtor. He put himself in debt. He says, give me the boy and I'm going to return him. That's not a guarantor. That's a question that's actually quoted in the Rishonim. The Sheiltas puts it that way. Another question is, how could we learn monetary law from Yehuda, which is not monetary law? Yehuda wasn't dealing with a price. Yehuda wasn't dealing with money. It wasn't like if Binyamin wasn't returned, then I'll pay you. Then you could say there's some sort of limud, there's some sort of learning that we can take from there and to learn about the dinim, the laws of a guarantor of an arid. But Yehuda wasn't like that at all. Yehuda was actually taking Binyamin and returning Binyamin. And how do we learn monetary law from that? How do we learn dine mamanos, monetary law, from the story and case of Yehuda? So it's two questions, but we could put it in one, and basically is Yehuda was very different. How in the world could we learn the dinim that we're trying to learn from Yehuda? It's a question on the opinion of Rav Huna. Before I go into the answer, I want to start with the point of the answer, the objective of the answer. And that's going to be that we actually don't learn the dinim of a guarantor, the actual laws of a guarantor, from Yehuda. We don't. Yehuda was very different, as I just said. So what are we learning from Yehuda? Being that Yehuda described his own position, right? When he spoke about himself, he says, Ki avdecha arev esanar, because I am the guarantor for this boy. That's what he told Yosef in this week's parsha. Since Yehuda described it in that way, so we are learning from Yehuda and relating it to the case of a guarantor. But they're not identical. They're not identical, but we are sort of, being that Yehuda described the situation, his circumstance and position as a guarantor, as an Ariv, that's why we are using him to learn from him. But let me explain what I just said in better terms, in a way that I think will be a lot more understandable. It goes like this. In understanding what is a guarantor in Halacha, what is a guarantor? There's two ways of understanding it. Either you could say, probably this might be the literal way, the way most people would describe it. You give him $100. If he doesn't have the $100 to pay, come to me and I will give you $100. In other words, I am making my money, I am committing my money to you. $100 of my money, I'm committing to back this loan. In Gemara terms, that would be called shibud mamanos. I'm obligating, it's a monetary obligation. Or you could say that actually being a guarantor is much greater than that. Being a guarantor means that if the loiva is not here to pay, if the person who's in debt is not here to pay, then I replace him. It's not that it's not a monetary commitment, it's a shibud haguf. I am obligating myself, I am committing myself. I am taking his place. So there's a big difference. There's a big difference between saying I'm committing my money or I'm committing myself. Now, in Halacha, there will be multiple differences, including in them is going to be our class today. But I just want to share with you sort of one of the more beautiful differences in Halacha. When I say beautiful, I mean enjoyable differences between saying that a Arev, a guarantor, is a monetary commitment, or is it a personal commitment? And the difference is that the Gemara says that Priyas Bal Chayv Mitzvah. You know, the fact that I have to repay a loan that, let's say, you gave me, it's not only ethical and moral that I have to pay back the loan, it's a mitzvah. It's a mitzvah to repay a loan. When I repay the loan, I get a mitzvah. You know, they used to say about Chassidim in the previous generations that they didn't need money, but they weren't in need of money, but they would lend each other money constantly. In other words, I'll borrow for a week and give you back, and then they would borrow from each other. Why? So they should each have the mitzvah of lending money and borrowing money and repaying the money. So repaying the money is a mitzvah. If we say that a guarantor is only a monetary commitment, then the guarantor doesn't get the mitzvah of repaying. It's not his mitzvah. It's the loiva's mitzvah. The man who's in debt, it's his mitzvah. He can't pay, so I'm paying up, but it's not my mitzvah. But if you say that it replaces the spot of the loiva, that by being a guarantor, by being an arev, I am stepping into his place, it becomes my mitzvah. This is just one of the more, beautiful differences between the two. But obviously there are other more complex halachic differences between the two. Again, What are the two? Is it a monetary commitment to be a guarantor, or is it a personal shibud aguf? I'm committing myself to be in his place. Based on how you would understand what a guarantor is, you would then say, does a guarantor of that we're describing here compare to the situation of Yehuda taking Binyamin in this week's parsha? If you hold that a guarantor is merely a monetary commitment, there's no relation between Yehuda and that. As I said before, Yehuda is such an intense commitment. That's not a monetary commitment. That's not a guarantor. If you understand the guarantor just to be a monetary, stepping in for the other person to cover his debt. However, if we say that being a guarantor means that I am stepping in the place of the loiva, I'm committing myself and replacing the person who's in debt, then there is a comparison between that and the situation of Yehuda in this week's parsha. So this becomes sort of the foundation of the opinions of Rav Chisda and Rav Huna. Rav Chisda looks at the story of Yehuda, he looks at a guarantor, and he says there's no similarity here. How could you learn this from that? Here, in the case of a guarantor, you're talking about a mere monetary commitment. In the case of Yehuda, you're talking about such an extreme commitment of completely giving himself over to take and return Binyamin. Or if you're in the shoes of Rav Huna and the perspective of Rav Huna says, wait a second, every guarantor is in the place of the loiva. Every guarantor is an intense commitment, is an extreme commitment to a degree. And therefore, it is comparable, and you could study the case of Yehuda and learn from it. So in other words, Rav Chisda's questioning of Rav Huna, where he said it's not comparable, was based on his own perspective of how he understood what an ariv, what a guarantor is. And based on that, he questioned. Okay, so I think we're already at a beautiful spot. That we see that Rav Huna and Rav Chisda see that a guarantor is a different role. They understand the position and the role of a guarantor differently. What will lead someone to say that a guarantor is this, or what will lead someone to say a guarantor is that? So now we want to go a step deeper, sort of into the heart of what really would make a person say that a guarantor is merely monetary or a guarantor is personal. We know it is a well-known Gemara, and it comes up in many different contexts. The term Kol Yisrael Arevim Zebuzeh. All of the Jewish people are Arevim. Arevim means guarantors for one another. It literally, most times, is translated as responsible for one another. That, when it comes to matters of hoichacha, of rebuke or teaching, educating somebody else, that, I am your responsibility, you're my responsibility. Right? So we're responsible for one another. I think someone just got on, and if you could please put on mute, I appreciate it. So Kol Yisrael Arevim Zebazeh means that we are all guarantors for one another. We're all responsible for one another. And it actually comes out in multiple halachas, in many halachas, that I'm responsible for you, you're responsible for me. I want to give an example. It's actually a very, very beautiful example. But first, the very idea that a person could come to a kiddush, or even if I come to your house, or you come to my home for Shabbos, and we make kiddush, and you are mitzi me, right? I am yotze my kiddush. I fulfill the obligation of making kiddush by listening to you make kiddush. Why does that work? If every Jew has to make kiddush, you have to make kiddush, I have to make kiddush. No. Kol Yisrael Arevim Zebazeh means that your kiddush could include me as well. But I want to take that one step further, because in Shulchan Aruch, it says something that really takes this idea to an extreme. That, say for example, a person already made kiddush in shul, and they come home and their wife and children and their family did not make Kiddush. They didn't hear Kiddush. So in Shulchan Aruch, there are different opinions of what to do, but one of the opinions says like this, that you could actually make Kiddush again. The husband or whoever it is coming home from shul could make another Kiddush. What do you mean make another Kiddush? He already made Kiddush. Why can he make two? Why can you do two? You know why? So I'm going to read the halacha inside because the words are so beautiful. But the idea is, if they didn't hear Kiddush, then I didn't hear Kiddush. Kol Yisrael Arevim Zebazeh means we are all obligated for one another. We are all guarantors for one another. Is that their lack of hearing Kiddush is an obligation on me as well. Let me read the words in halacha. If you think I'm being extreme, because it's what it says. This quote is actually from Shulchan Aruch Harav in Orach Chaim in the laws of Shabbos. He says, so first he sets the thing. He says, Af mi she'einu mechuyev b'davar mipnei shekfar yatzi dechavasa. Even someone who's not obligated in making Kiddush because he already did it in shul. So yachol levarich lemisha dayan leyatza. They could make a bracha for other people that were not yet yotze and did not yet hear Kiddush. Lefi, why? Because mitzvahs that are an obligation, kol Yisrael arevim zebazeh. We are all responsible for one another. We all guarantors for one another. V'gam hu nikra mechuyev b'davar. Even he who already heard Kiddush is also obligated since his friend did not yet fulfill his obligation. You see, it's Kol Yisrael Arevim Zebazeh is not just a beautiful statement. I'm responsible for you, you're responsible for me. Its halachic ramifications are so deep that if you didn't hear Kiddush, it lacks in my Kiddush. I'm still obligated. In fact, to better understand this idea of Kol Yisrael Arevim Zebazeh, there are Sfarim that bring that the words that Kol Yisrael Arevim means we are guarantors, but Arevim also means like mi'uravim, we're mixed together. Because to quote the idea that the Arizal says, he says that all of Klal Yisrael are koima achas shlema. We are part of one organism, of one body. So, the tzaddikim are the heads, and then there's the feet, there's the arms, there's the legs. We're all part of one body. So therefore, your obligation is my obligation is your obligation. So because Kol Yisrael mi'uravim, because we are all one, mixed together, therefore we are arevim, therefore we are guarantors and responsible for one another. So now comes the question. We see that in Halacha, this concept of being guarantors for one another clearly applies in situations of a mitzvah. Now the question becomes, does it apply in places that are not a mitzvah? Does the idea that we are all one also have halachic ramifications in areas outside of performing a mitzvah like Kiddush? And here's where we're going to get to. We're going to get to the difference of Rav Huna and Rav Chizda. Rav Chizda would say no. The idea that Klal Yisrael are one, Kol Yisrael Arevim Zebazeh, we're all one and we're responsible for one another. You know why? Because in the nefesh, in our souls, in our neshama, we are all one. Okay, but not in our bodies, not in our money. Our money, we're separate. So I cannot become a guarantor to the extent that I come into your place. I can take a monetary obligation to fill the money that you don't have to pay, so I'll pay instead of you. But I cannot fill your spot because Kol Yisrael Arevim Zebazeh is only for spiritual matters. Matters of the nefesh, matters of mitzvahs. Rav Huna says no. The unity of the Jewish people is so great and so deep that even when it comes to monetary things, and a person says, I'm going to be your guarantor, for the money, what they mean to say is, I'm going to step into your place. You know why? Because Kol Yisrael Arevim Zebazeh, because we are all mi'uravim, we are all one. And being that we are all one, I could actually take your spot. In a loan, in a monetary loan, not only in a mitzvah like Kiddush, but also in physical, monetary, material things. So let's get back to our chart. You see, we had the first opinion was Rav Chizda, sort of the more conventional opinion that when you're a guarantor, you're only covering in for the debt. Why does he say that? Because Arevim, that all of Bnei Klal Yisrael are one, is a reference to the neshama. And only regarding spiritual matters could you say that I am you, you are me, and we are all obligated for each other. That's the opinion of Rav Chizda. Rav Huna comes and says, no, when I become a guarantor, I could actually step into your place. You know why? Because Kol Yisrael Arevim does not only mean for the neshama, it also means for physical, bodily things. So also when it comes to material matters, we could all become one, and I could actually step in your place. And that's why I could learn the laws of Arvus when it comes to a monetary law from Yehuda, because Yehuda had that intense, commitment. But really, when two Jews are committing to one another with the monetary things, being that they are mi'uravim, they're kol yisrael arevim zeh b'zeh, he could actually have that similar commitment. Just to add one point, is that from all the Shvatim, it was only Yehuda who stepped in to do this. Now, obviously, in Pshat, in Remez, and Drush, and so there are many different reasons why Yehuda was the person who could commit to Binyamin, that to the extent that Yaakov agreed. Rashi brings reasons, there are other reasons too. My daughter came home from school, taught me a new reason I never learned before. I'll tell you, she told me, I'm sharing it because it's a chiddush. Maybe it's in one of the common Mefarshim, but he says that because Yehuda, we know from previous Parshias, Yehuda lost his children, right? Er and Oinan, they passed away. Right? Tamar, his daughter-in-law, was married to them and they passed away. So Yaakov said, Yehuda, that had already a taste of missing a child and losing a child, will, sacrifice himself to the extreme, not to allow that to happen to me. In other words, Yaakov felt that Yehuda was someone who would take it seriously because he unfortunately had to go through such an experience. But anyways, I never heard that before. It was a chiddush to me. But now let's go back to where we're talking about. From sort of a deeper perspective, why was Yehuda the one who was able to tap in to this incredible unity? Because Yehuda, we know, is the Melech, the king of the Shvatim. He was the king amongst the Shvatim. Next week's Parsha, he gets the bracha of being the king. Lo Yasser Shevet mi Yehuda. Kingship was given to Yehuda and to his family, to his descendants, David HaMelech and David's descendants. According to Halacha, the Rambam writes, and the Rogatchover Goyen explains it as follows. He says, what is the idea of a Melech? Why does Judaism want a king? What does a king do? A king takes Klal Yisrael from being many individuals and makes them into a tzibur, makes them into a single unit. That is what the job of a king is. That is, when I say job, I mean that's the role. That's the essential role of a king, is to take all of Klal Yisrael and make them into one. Because he's the common factor between all of them. He unites their spiritual, but also their material. Everything becomes under one ownership, the ownership of the king. So Yehuda, being the king of the Shvatim, was exactly the one candidate, the one person who was able to tap in to such a great unity, to the extent that we learn, when it comes to a guarantor, we learn from that unity that we could all be one, even in monetary things. I could step in for you and you could step in for me, not only to replace the debt, but actually to fill in your spot. So that is the laws of Arvus. As I mentioned in the past, the Shalach Kaddish says that every parsha that we learn also relates to the parsha of the week. Also relates, to the time of year that we read it. In other words, the parsha relates to the time of year. Asar B'Tevis is this Friday. As I mentioned earlier, Asar B'Tevis is the most severe and harsh from all the fasts, to the extent that if it would fall on Shabbos, we would fast on Shabbos, because it was the beginning. But nevertheless, in it must be also the greatest hidden good. What's the hidden good of Asar B'Tevis? The hidden good of Asar B'Tevis is, as the Gemara says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu maktim refuah l'maka. Hashem always places the cure before the before the makkah, before the ailment. We learned this actually, it's a Gemara Megillah, because we learned it from Esther and Haman, that Esther was in place for the salvation before even Haman rose to power. So in other words, the cure was there before the ailment. The ailment that we are facing when it comes to Asar B'Tevis is the obvious ailment of the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. Galus, exile. Exile from Yerushalayim, exile from the Holy Land, exile without a Beis Hamikdash. Hashem put the refuah, put the cure before. What's the cure? The cure is actually, how ironic this may sound, was actually the event of Asar B'Tevis, where Yerushalayim was put into a siege. Now, if we think about it, a siege is a terrible thing. However, there's no destruction. Nobody, doesn't say that they harmed anybody, doesn't say that they broke Yerushalayim, they destroyed Yerushalayim, or even that they even touched the walls of Yerushalayim. What did they do? It was Bnei Yisrael in Yerushalayim, without any outside influence, without anybody from inside being able to leave. Within Asar B'Tevis is a hidden message. The hidden message is that the refuah for this makkah, the healing, the remedy for this ailment of the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash is Jewish unity. Jewish unity in a way that Klal Yisrael are one and together, which is, I know this is ironic, but essentially what actually took place in Asar B'Tevis. Obviously, unfortunately, it led to worse and worse, and that's why we fast. But in essence, in its most dry and pure form, what Asar B'Tevis is Bnei Yisrael just together alone. And where are they together? In Yerushalayim. Yerushalayim is Yiras Shalom. It's ultimate Yiras Shamayim. In other words, it's not an achdus. It's not a unity where we have to compromise on Yiras Shamayim, on matters of Torah and mitzvahs. It's an ultimate unity that includes also an ultimate of Yerushalayim, of Yiras Shamayim. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu shows us on Asar B'Tevis, this is the remedy for this ailment. The ailment of destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, it is this unity that will repair it, and that will bring the Geula, bring us back to the Beis Hamikdash, the rebuilding of the Beis Hamikdash. So we studied today about an extreme and achdus and unity amongst the Jewish people. Kol Yisrael Arevim Zeh B'Zeh, and we see that Asar B'Tevis has that message as well. I want to summarize what we did today. We studied the Gemara about what's the source of arvos, what's the source of a guarantor in Halacha, that one person could be a guarantor for another person when it comes to money. Excuse me. And Rav Huna says the source is from Yehuda in this week's parsha. Rav Chizda says no, that's not possible. Yehuda was much more extreme than that. That's not an Arev. And we said that ultimately it comes down to the understanding of what is an Arev, what is a guarantor. Is a guarantor merely a monetary thing? In that case, you can't compare it to Yehuda. Yehuda is very different. However, if an Arev is more than a monetary placement, but rather a personal commitment to take over the spot of the loiva, take over the spot of the person who's in debt, then the truth is, you could learn it from Yehuda, because that's the style of commitment that Yehuda made and Yehuda had. And what would make a person say that a person, that an Arev, someone who's a guarantor, is only monetary, or that an Arev, a guarantor, is also personal? It depends how you read the words Kol Yisrael Arevim Zeh B'Zeh. Do you read it and say it's limited to holy matters? It's limited to matters of Torah mitzvahs, either in mitzvahs aseh like kiddush, or mitzvahs leisa set to, that we all have to warn each other to make sure that we're not, violating a mitzvah? Or do you say that Kol Yisrael Arevim Zeh B'Zeh, the Kol Yisrael Mi'uravim, that we're all one, could also extend to our physical and material lives as well, to monetary law? When one person takes a loan and another person says, I will commit, I'll be the guarantor for that loan, he could actually step in. Why? Because Kol Yisrael Arevim, he's one with him. We concluded that this idea, this achdus that we're learning from Yehuda, I just want to add one more thing. We learned this from Yehuda specifically because Yehuda was the melech. And a melech's role is this unity of bringing all of Klal Yisrael into one single unit. that type of achdus is the type of achdus that we're learning about when we think about what Asar B'Tevis is. That Asar B'Tevis' hidden message is, the hidden good in Asar B'Tevis is the powerful message that the remedy for the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash is the achdus, the unity that's sort of buried within the story of Asar B'Tevis. So although I'm tempted to conclude by saying everyone should have an easy fast, but we just said we want Mashiach. So then in Golus, obviously we should have an easy fast, but we really hope that, as the Rambam says, Yehafchu Yamim Elu L'Sasen L'Simcho L'Moedim Tovim, that Asidim in the future, the Rambam says, all of these fast days will become Yamim Tovim, become holidays. And in that case, there'll be no fasting on Friday. In fact, what will that do? That will make Asar B'Tevis into a much greater Yom Tov. Because if it's the most severe of the fasts, it must be a much greater Yom Tov. And the Niska, may we merit to live it and to see it. And I guess the main takeaway from our share today is may we live in Achdus Yisrael, in ultimate unity in all matters of spirit and matters of material things. And and then it will drive away the Golus with Hashem's help. Shikoyach, everybody.
Shikoach, may it be a meaningful fast for everyone.
That's a better term.
Okay.
Because a meaningful Asar B'Tevis goes either way. Either, in Geula or unfortunately in Golus, we're hoping for a meaningful Asar B'Tevis.
Thank you so much. It was really great.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.